And welcome to this segment of TI Now. We're joined by Travis Hall. He's a telecommunications policy analyst with the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And Travis, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here. Of course, we're talking about the policy challenges around the Internet of Things. I want to talk really about what it was like prior to the advent of IoT and then what those challenges look like now afterwards.
To a large extent, they're not different. The Internet of Things has actually been with us for a long time. It kind of depends on how you look at the Internet of Things and what you define it as. And most people at the base level, you can definitely make arguments around the edges, look at it as a spread of connectivity and computational power into more and more devices, with the emphasis being on more and more, right? So prior to the Internet of Things, it was just simply fewer devices had internet connectivity, things that we would traditionally think of as having internet connectivity, mobile phones, computers, things like that. The Internet of Things really, truly, again, we can argue about the technological boundaries of this, but at its core is just simply an increase of scale and scope for connectivity and computational power into not just simply more devices, but smaller devices and devices that never had connectivity before. So in terms of what that means for policy challenges, we've been dealing with internet policy challenges since the 1970s, 80s. We've been dealing with connectivity challenges in terms of like telephone and wireline connectivity issues since the telegraph, right? So the question is how does this not simply are there new policy challenges, which of course there are to a certain extent, but rather how are these policy challenges different given the scale and scope change? And changes in scale and scope are not just simply quantitative, right? Scale and scope change actually does make qualitative differences in both what opportunities are available for different businesses, for different entrepreneurial possibilities, for different ways in which government can interact with people. It also gives new opportunities, qualitative changes and differences in how we interact with each other, in the formations of our social relations with one another. And it's those qualitative changes which come with these quantitative differences in terms of the scale, scope, and availability of connectivity that actually are raising then these new policy challenges. And so that is probably how I would best put it as with these trends are coming qualitative differences that actually do require some time and attention.
Now, there are some technology challenges or issues that could hinder the development of IoT, and there's things that the NTIA or the government can do about that, possibly in the realm of maybe spectrum availability or potential congestion, interference, or availability of network infrastructure. Those are just some examples. What can the NTIA do and what are they doing?
Going back again to what the Internet of Things is, being the spread of connectivity, connectivity is the lifeblood, right? Without connectivity, you don't really have the Internet of Things because it would just simply be devices. Your internet-connected hammer would revert to just being a hammer, which might not be the worst thing in the world, but in some cases it actually is quite hard and difficult. And when your internet-connected car, which relies on the internet to keep it safe, to keep it running, suddenly stops functioning in terms of its full functionality, that's actually a much more serious issue. And so what the NTIA and the administration have been working very hard on, is making more spectrum available, commercially available, with the goal of having 500 megahertz free, or identified to be made commercially available by the end of the administration. And also with Broadband USA and the BTOP grants that my agency have been overseeing, trying to spread more connectivity to more areas, making sure that everyone does have connectivity. Because one of the key issues with this is, with any technological revolution, is these things don't happen within a vacuum, right? They happen within larger socioeconomic contexts, and it's really necessary to be intentional about ensuring that this change and this spread and this development actually helps everyone. And that is one of the things that the administration has been particularly focused on in terms of making sure that connectivity, not just simply focused on the Internet of Things, but connectivity writ large, is being spread and made available both for commercial purposes, but also for everyone. And the Internet of Things is absolutely riding that wave.
Now, of course, public-private partnerships are always important in any really sector. IoT is not excluded from that. Can you give us possibly maybe an example of a public-private partnership with IoT?
I would say that NOAA is probably a great example of an agency, the EPA as well, of an agency using these technologies, using sensors in novel and important ways in order to gather data, gather information that then is not just simply useful for their mission space. NOAA, of course, being in charge of weather and the fisheries. But then also made available for broader commercial use. And I will make a caveat that I'm not entirely sure what the EPA does with all of its data, but I know that there are many commercial services that are dependent on NOAA, not just simply weather.com, right, that directly uses the NOAA data in order to better inform the public about the weather, but then also anything that depends on the weather being good depends on this data, on being able to predict what the weather is, depends on this data. And having more and better data being driven by larger, more sensitive, more nuanced sensor networks, which is the Internet of Things, is a great example of how a federal agency is using these technologies, oftentimes driven by private sector innovation in terms of what the sensors are, how to use them, using the networks, the connectivity networks. Of course, there isn't a government internet, right? That then feed back into, with a positive loop, feed back into the commercial space.
I want to stick with the private sector just for a minute. Of course, the Internet of Things, anytime you're connecting machine to machine, could have a potential short-term or long-term impact on the human workforce. Is the NTIA already sort of taking that into account?
NTIA is taking lead on a Department of Commerce-wide initiative on the Internet of Things that is going to culminate in a policy, we call it a green paper, I don't know if anyone else uses that term, but a policy paper from the Department of Commerce. And so with one of the things that the Department of Commerce, not so just NTIA, but the Department of Commerce brings to the Internet of Things is a ecosystem-wide perspective. So NTIA is focused primarily on telecommunications information issues. Workforce, to a certain extent, falls outside of the purview. It does not fall outside of the purview of the Department of Commerce, particularly looking at the ecosystem-wide perspective that we are able to bring to the table. And with that in mind, there are absolutely going to be impacts on workforce, both in terms of traditional cliched, to a certain extent, changes in how workers interact with and are replaced by more efficient technologies, and the absolute necessity to ensure that people are trained and capable of using these technologies and also servicing these technologies. My father was a mechanic, and I don't think, and he hates computers. He would much rather bang on something with a hammer or screw it with a wrench. That's not going to be enough anymore in order to service the cars of tomorrow. And that being said, there's also other workforce issues that I think are going to be shaping our lives to come, in as much as we are seeing a greater degree of flexibility in terms of how people work. People can work from home. People can work remotely. Uber has totally freed up the rental car taxi-like services, but that does require certain degrees of centralized control, and those are being put off onto devices, connected devices, algorithms, things like that. I know that UPS, for example, has lots of devices that actually track measurements of how well its delivery drivers are doing. And that I think is going to open up new fronts of negotiation between workers and employers as well.
Now, I know the NTIA is involved in cybersecurity and also privacy concerns around the Internet of Things. I want to start with cybersecurity. And we've gotten sort of like the general answers from people about cyber concerns with IoT. We've heard that before, but is there a specific example that maybe NTIA is working on right now?
Absolutely. So the question is about cybersecurity concerns and what NTIA is doing about it. And NTIA is actively involved in many different fronts on cybersecurity, although of course we're one of many agencies that are actively working on this. One thing that we are doing in particular is we have held a series of multi-stakeholder processes on intellectual property right, privacy, and more recently, cybersecurity. And we are going to be opening up a new work stream, a new multi-stakeholder process on transparency in Internet of Things patchability. So what that means is the Internet of Things, you have a device. When you sell a device, there's going to be bugs in it. And anytime there's software, there's going to be a bug. And that's okay. That's normal. Code is hard, and there will inevitably be a few mistakes here or there. What's important is whether or not you can then go back to that software and fix it once you've found the bug, once you've found the problem. We all know this. We have it on our mobile phones. You have to update the software every so often. On your computers, you have to update it. The question is when you have like 100 different devices in your home, how do you patch it? Do you know if it's patchable? When you buy something, can you actually tell whether or not this software can be patched so that it will be secure in the future? And what are the responsibilities that you have? Do you have to touch a button? Do you have to do nothing? Do you have to take a dongle and plug it into your computer and then plug it into your device? None of these things are clear right now. So what we're working on is we're working on trying to create a common vocabulary, common language that's consumer focused, that will help both the consumer to understand what patchability capabilities are of the devices they buy, but then also for the companies that have good cybersecurity practices, that are investing in this, to be able to advertise this and show that they are using this. And we are bringing together stakeholders from academia, industry, civil society, and across the IoT ecosystem to have that conversation.
Now let's shift to some of the privacy concerns around the Internet of Things, and really maybe the difference between privacy and IoT and really just privacy concerns in general.
I would say that there's not really a lot of difference. Again, the question being scale, scope. One of the big things that is fundamental to privacy concerns is what people call creepiness, right? What's creepy? And it would be really nice if somebody actually sat down and did a definition of what that is. And I would say that a working definition of what is creepy in terms of privacy is when information is being collected or used or shared in ways that are against what your expectations are, against what the social norms are, the general social norms are. And the truth is that social norms change, right? At one point in time, if you walked around talking to yourself, you'd be looked at as crazy. Now you walk around talking to yourself on your mobile phone, and people not only don't think you're crazy, they ignore what you're saying. Right? It would be weird if somebody came up and actually started talking to you about the conversation you just had. And so that would be creepy, right? And so the question is these developing social norms. And so what the Internet of Things is doing is it is disrupting these social relationships. It is disrupting what type of information is collected, how it's shared, and how it's used. And the fundamental thing that we're going to be needing to grapple with moving forward is how much are these social norms just going to evolve and change on their own, and how much are these disruptions going to be too disruptive, right? How much are they going to be beyond the expectations and the reasonable expectations of the consumers such that they are harmful?
Now there's a number of fronts that really need to kind of converge, if you will, in order for IoT to continue moving forward, evolving, right? So you have infrastructure, us, policy, you guys, technology, sort of the whole gamut, right? And then you have the investors, investment banks, and so forth. What's the NTIA's role in sort of making sure all that coalesces?
So what the Department of Commerce, let me take it back a little bit from NTIA and talk about the Department of Commerce. So the Department of Commerce has significant experience with working with the Internet of Things. NTIA itself specifically has been working on telecommunications policy issues since the 80s at least, really truly at the center of the fights that have helped to define the Internet as we know it today. And then the Department of Commerce as a whole, NOAA has been working with IoT. NIST is huge in terms of developing standards, in terms of understanding what the technologies are, where they're going, and helping to in cooperation with the private sector, develop these standards that help enable innovation, enable growth. So we come to it with a bevy of experience. Also, we come to it with a broad perspective. There are many government agencies right now focused on the Internet of Things, but they're focused on their mission silos, right? The Department of Transportation, quite rightly, is focused on cars. The FDA is quite rightly focused on health-connected devices. The Department of Energy, quite rightly, focused completely on smart grids, right? And we have a decent amount of cross-cutting interest in automated vehicles and then also smart cities. But all of these are somewhat siloed, right? And so what the Department of Commerce is bringing to the table is bringing this broad-scale perspective of saying, what are these larger trends in terms of connectivity? What are the challenges that are being posed towards making sure that we can foster innovation and maximize the benefit of these technologies while protecting consumers, while protecting citizens? And so that's what we're bringing to the table, and that's what we're working on right now.
Travis, you said earlier that the NTIA or the Department of Commerce has been in the middle of the sort of the fight, quote unquote, with IoT since back in the 80s, even further back than that. But what has happened, let's say, in the last 5 years that really has changed technology policy in IoT? Like, does something stick out to you?
There are probably a few different things. The first being a recognition that the Internet of Things is something worth looking at as a thing, right? Again, Internet policy has been worked on for a long time. Telecommunications policy has been worked on for a long time. But looking at the Internet of Things specifically as something worthy of attention in and of itself, as this trend set, right? That is absolutely something that is relatively new. We've known about it, we've talked about it. Connected devices aren't new, but looking at it as an actual thing to be concerned about, I would say, is relatively recent in some parts of the government. I also think that there's just simply ever-evolving changes in policy. For example, at the FTC is taking a much greater role in looking at and being concerned about not just the Internet of Things, but other areas of cybersecurity concern, privacy concern. They've always been involved in that, but they've taken a more active role. The FCC is starting to take a more interest in a more active role as well. I think that we're just beginning to see some of these changes in the way policymakers think about these issues and how we're going to be grappling with them in the future.
Travis, in your last answer, you talked about a little bit about the future of the Internet of Things. Where do you see IoT from a policy perspective over the next, let's say, 5 years?
I think at some point in time we're not going to stop talking about the Internet of Things, to be perfectly honest. I think that this is important for us to talk about right now. I think at some point in time we're going to stop talking about that, because I think that what we're talking about is we're talking about the spread of connectivity and computational power, and at some point in time it's going to be like electricity. Right? It's just going to be spread, right? Not everything will be connected to the internet, but enough things will be connected to the internet that we will be dealing with it in practice as opposed to being concerned about the trend set. And so I think in terms of the policy, what it ultimately means is just simply these issues that we've been grappling with: cybersecurity, privacy, connectivity, infrastructure. These are all things that we've been dealing with for a long time, but we've been dealing with them at a fairly small scale, and the stakes have been not low, but relatively low. I think that is what's ultimately going to be the qualitative difference, is that the concerns about connectivity, the concerns about cybersecurity, the concerns about privacy are just going to increase in scale, they're going to increase in scope, and most importantly, the stakes are going to be so much higher. When your pacemaker is internet connected, it's a much different thing than whether or not, if your internet goes down, than if your computer does.
And thanks for your time, Travis.
Thank you.